When it came out in 2015, Ori and the Blind Forest was quite a surprise. This game came in towards the beginning of what I'm going to call the Metroidvania Renaissance, releasing a few years after Guacamelee and Dust: An Elysian Tale, and coming out within months of a few of its contemporaries such as Castle in the Darkness and Environmental Station Alpha. 1 year later came Momodora: Reverie Under the Moonlight, followed by Hollow Knight in 2017. Sure, Metroidvanias never really stopped being made, but in my memory at least, this was the time period where they really started to shine and become a thing people were really looking for. Where Guacamelee was a stylized and accessible title that put a real spotlight on engaging combat, and Environmental Station Alpha was a more classic experience with a massive emphasis on exploration, Ori instead was a beautifully cinematic experience with a focus on movement and platforming. I believe it was the beautiful and cinematic portion that initially caught people's eyes and hooked people into the game, with a gorgeous hand-drawn look that wasn't often seen, and a heart-wrenching introduction to the story that reminded people of Carl and Ellie's story at the beginning of Pixar's Up. It turns out that underneath all of that shine, Ori and the Blind Forest was also a pretty solid game. There are those who would call it a masterpiece, but as much as I still love it, and might have agreed at the time, having played it again recently, well, there are a few parts of it that are pretty rough, but we'll get to that. For now, here's your usual spoiler warning. I'll be spoiling the entirety of both Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps in this video, so if that frightens you, then make sure you add this video to your watch later list for the future. Although it ended in somewhat of a minor cliffhanger with the egg in the family's hut, it was hard to imagine where Ori's story would go after the Blind Forest. After a somber introduction where Naru, Ori's adoptive mother figure, dies of malnourishment as the forest they inhabit withers away, Ori goes on an adventure to remedy what ails the forest while making a friend or two along the way. The forest comes back to life in the end, with Ori living happily together with a revived Naru, their new friend Gumo, who proves to be a brilliant engineer by the way, and the last surviving egg from the game's central antagonist, a dark owl named Kuro. All's good, so where's the conflict for the next game? Ori and the Will of the Wisps begins in a familiar way, an interactive story segment that starts not long after the end of the events of the Blind Forest. The egg hatches a small plot owl, named Ku. Ku has a deformed wing, possibly caused by the trauma to her egg in the first game, rendering her unable to fly. Luckily, Ori has the good idea to use Kuro's feather, a power from the previous game that I guess was kept as a keepsake, to patch up the broken wing, which gives Ku the extra lift that she needs to fly. Gumo, being the brilliant engineer that he is, ties it on with a single piece of string. I'm sure it's fine. With her newly fixed wing, Ori and Ku go on a test flight and go way too far, following some other birds across a body of water to a new land that's covered in darkness and thunderstorms and... whoops. A slight bit of turbulence causes the feather to come off, sending the two careening down to the surface of the corrupted forest of Naiwen, a place not unlike Nibel, though one where the light of the spirit willow has been lost for quite some time at this point, resulting in a dangerous and dying land. In spite of how long the willow's light has been gone, Naiwen feels remarkably more alive than Nibel ever did. Part of this is due to the wider array of enemy types you come across, but this time there are friendly NPCs that litter the world as well. Naiwen is home to the Moki, the simple-minded mouse creatures, the Gorlex, a sort of dwarf-looking creature with a penchant for building stuff, and a few other friendly creature types that I don't remember the name of but are just as important. These creatures wander the world as you do, so you run into them from time to time as you're adventuring. It does feel a bit weird that this place is teeming with life when Nibel felt completely dead by comparison, but I'm just going to chalk that up to the smaller scope of design that the original game had. The core of the conflict in Ori and the Will of the Wisps is Ku. First finding her, and then healing her after Shriek, the central antagonist, gravely wounds her. Looking back on it, the inciting incident here feels sort of contrived. I don't want to cry moralism here, but I found it pretty silly that a single feather from a larger owl tied on with a string was enough to allow this poor little baby bird with a busted wing to fly well enough to get to this new land, only for it to predictably fall off and thrust the duo into a dangerous world. The introduction is beautiful and touching, but the circumstances are just kind of silly, and I really don't think it had to be this way. Naiwen is a land in need, and though the light of the spirit willow here was lost, wisps of that light remain alive and waiting for someone to collect them and make them whole. Ku could have been born with 2 good wings, and Ori could have heard the call of the Wisps from across the water, or could have otherwise been drawn there by their will. The will of the Wisps. Huh. Ori would have persuaded Ku to carry it across the water, where the storm causes Ku to injure her wing, and the rest could have been the same from there. As it is now, Ku makes the choice to fly over the water with a makeshift wing and no flying experience, making the entire inciting incident feel coincidental, and gives Ku the unenviable position of not just needing to be rescued, but also being the one who made the fatal mistake that landed them here in the first place. Making it be Ori's decision would have added so much weight to the crash and to the initial journey to find your friend who you landed in trouble with your request to be carried across the water. I think that would have made Ku feel much less like a plot device and, more importantly, less like a character who can't do anything right. On your way to find Ku, you run into a lot of the forest's native creatures, including the self-proclaimed guardian of the forest, Kwolok. Soon after, you find Ku somewhere in Shriek's territory, and a few minutes after being reunited, you're split up again as Ku gets curb-stomped by Shriek. Luckily, Ku isn't dead, just gravely injured. Kwolok offers his home as a place for the Moki to watch over Ku, and Frog Dad drops the game's ultimate quest on your shoulders. Collect the Wisps. Wisps is a hard word. Collect the Wisps remaining from the Spirit Willow's shattered light to gain the power to restore Nywyn and save your friend. If what I said earlier about Ku being a poor character who is relegated to a plot device didn't make sense before, I hope it does now. Aside from the introductory sequence and the 10 to 15 minutes that we just spent playing with Ku in a bit of a gameplay diversion, we have no time to spend with this character. We're supposed to feel sorry for the bird and for Ori given that they're best friends and basically siblings, but the amount of development given to Ku compared to the amount of time spent trying to rescue her is just as bad or worse than a certain Keyblade wielder that we all know. I'm all for a well-paced feels fest, and I'll freely admit that this scene made me tear up a little bit, but if I were to sit here and really analyze it, I don't think I was sad because I truly cared for the character of Ku. I felt sad because of the game's presentation, the music, the sound design, and the cinematography and the color. It all told me that I should feel sad, and so I did. And while this is an indictment of the story's flow and the not quite stellar character writing in this game, it also illustrates just how beautifully this game is put together on a presentational level. Ori in the Blind Forest looks incredible, but Ori in the Will of the Wisps blows that away on every level. The backgrounds, the color, the fluid animation, everything is at least twice as detailed as it has any right to be and is such a treat to take in as you explore this game's world. The backgrounds are so dense with details that you could probably stare at them for hours and still find something new the next day, and while that's definitely impressive, I have to shout out the game's phenomenal use of color in its world. From the dark web-covered halls of fungus of the Moldwood Depths that does a good job of creeping you out and making you feel like you're in danger, to the bright and colorful tropical flora of the Luma pools that feels like you're on a brief vacation from the terror of Nywyn, and the snow-touched peaks of Bar's Reach, with the sunset reflecting off the bright surface of the ground. While many of the areas don't pop quite like these, it all feels like it's really a part of this world, with some fun theming and visual and mechanical variety between each area to shake things up. And that's not even to mention the nice little detail of having the spikes in each area not just be simple spikes. They're always representative of the area that you're in. For example, in Moldwood Depths, there are these creepy, gross-looking bug things, and in other areas they might still be bugs, but they're different kinds of bugs. It's just a nice little detail that you don't see very often. And as great as the Blind Forest still looks today, I can't help but notice that the colors look downright washed out in comparison to Will of the Wisps. This game just looks beautiful. I do have a bit more to say about the game's story and presentation, but for now, let's take a little bit of a detour and move on to the segments that most of you probably care about: the combat and gameplay. If there's anything in Ori and the Blind Forest that doesn't hold up, it's the combat. In fact, that game's combat was pretty horrid even for the day, so bad that it's hard for me to even call it combat. Most of the enemies were slow-moving or static obstacles that stopped you from platforming as freely as you wanted, and defeating them was as simple and as tedious as Each press of the button sent out little shots of light towards the nearest target that was in range. No thought, no challenge, no fun. There are a couple of other moves that you can use for combat, but the light was your main weapon. Even though the game softly incentivized combat with the use of a level-up system, which I found pretty out of place in Ori specifically, it was rarely ever required to move forward. Most of the time you would just fly past or bash through any enemy that was in your way, if you didn't have to otherwise defeat it so you could use a wall or something. And because of the relatively low frequency of required combat, the lackluster combat system was pretty easy to accept. The game was more about platforming anyway, and the light combat elements, as bad as they were, helped make the platforming shine by giving you a little something to do in between jumps. And though I think the combat in the Blind Forest is ultimately okay for what the game is, going into Ori and the Will of the Wisps, it was the biggest thing that I wanted to be changed. And ooh boy was it changed. The first thing you acquire in this game is a little flaming stick that you can swing around as a weapon, and the first ability you find is a freaking sword made out of light. Ori and the Will of the Wisps sends a message from the very beginning of the game this time. Where the Blind Forest was mostly focused on platforming with some light combat elements, the combat this time is going to be serious. Ori gets a large arsenal of weapons throughout the game: a hammer, a shuriken, bow and arrows, a fireball that you can use as a bash projectile and a weapon, and that's only about half of it. You'll find that you're not short on options as you crash forward through this game, and you'll also find that you're really happy to have these options available as the enemies here are far more aggressive than they were in the Blind Forest. And though the enemies are more aggressive, they're only really relevant to the challenge on your first run through an area. Typically when I explore, I like to stop and look around to assess my options while I make a decision or figure out what needs to be done, and that's typically hard to do when there are enemies trying to kill you. After you've conquered an area, however, the enemies are relegated into mere springboards for your masterful platforming, which is further reinforced by the fact that all of your mid-air movement abilities, your double jump and your dash, etc., are reset after successfully hitting an enemy with your sword. I can't recall where this was ever mentioned by the game, but it's a mechanic that becomes pretty important later on when you fight some of the game's bosses. Where Ori and the Blind Forest didn't really have any bosses to speak of, it did have a lot of escape sequences that took the place as the game's bosses. And with a focus on platforming over combat, it makes sense that the game's boss fights were just challenging, timed platforming challenges. Will of the Wisps has this too, but the boss fights are now split in between these escape sequences and some actual, honest-to-God, boss fights. And these fights are just as much of a spectacle as the rest of the game is. There are only 6 boss fights in the entire game, but most of them are long and multi-phase challenges worthy of the name boss. They each capstone their own section of the game in a flashy and memorable way. A few of the sections have an escape sequence instead of a boss, but most of the bosses have their own little tiny escape sequence built into it as well. I'm going to speak briefly about each one. Howl is the first antagonist of the game, stalking you from the moment you land in Nightwind. Before you even have the means to properly defend yourself, you're cornered by this beast after a brief and simple chase sequence. You have no choice left but to fight with nothing more than a small flaming stick with criminally low reach. It's worth noting that I dove straight into hard mode when I started this game, but I found this fight pretty difficult to be thrown in so early. This fight is a mere 20 or so minutes into the game, meaning you have no combat experience, no upgrades, and no tools to toy around with. Thankfully, Howl's moves are heavily telegraphed, and most of the difficulty comes from perception than anything else. Howl doesn't do much damage, is slow and predictable, and while it looks like it's got a monstrous health bar, the fight is over after you take away about half of its health, sending the beast running home to lick its wounds. That was a very welcome twist that caught me off guard and gave me the enticing promise of a rematch in the future, once Ori and the player both become more capable. Okay, so the Horned Beetle isn't nearly at the same level as the rest of the bosses in this game. It's a fine boss fight that requires some trial and error at first, but once you understand the creature's movements, it becomes trivial to avoid and take down. I found this boss fight to be a very well-tuned boss and a lot of fun for the part of the game in which you fight it, and somewhat reminiscent of the massive moss charger from Hollow Knight, in that the boss comes from seemingly out of nowhere in a place that wasn't very obviously a boss arena. It's a weird fight though that stands out from the rest of the bosses in this game, in that it's just not very impactful, memorable, difficult, or complex. You'll understand what I mean as we cover the rest of the bosses. Mora is one of the two mid-game bosses. You can choose to fight her or Frog Dad Kwolok first, and whichever one you choose might inform your decision of which of the two is harder based on how thoroughly you've explored for upgrades. I chose Mora first, which may have been a mistake because she took me a solid 20 minutes worth of attempts to finally take down. If I'm remembering correctly, I entered this boss fight without any of the damage upgrades you can find throughout the world, with the exception of a couple of shards, and her health bar is as enormous as her figure implies. And don't let that size fool you either. Mora is anything but slow, capable of relentlessly chasing down Ori as you bounce from wall to wall, desperately trying to avoid her wide attacks. This is around the time that I noticed that your longest range and quickest firing ability, the bow and arrow, does a negligible amount of damage. In fact, I found that any kind of hit and run tactic that I tried to employ with ranged attacks against this boss were completely fruitless because they simply didn't do nearly enough damage. I tried pelting her with arrows, slicing her up with the shuriken, and even setting her on fire, but it all pales in comparison to just comboing her to death with your sword. But by far the best damage you can do during this phase is from throwing her own projectiles back into her face, which is much easier said than done given the distance you've probably put between the two of you and the erratic nature of her movements, with only her head being targetable. That relatively small hitbox, combined with the fact that you take damage simply for running into her face with your body, makes this fight even more difficult to contend with. When she's lunging at you, it's hard to truly tell if you're going to get hit by her face or her claws as you dive through the most precarious gaps imaginable, wondering if you're about to die and then wondering how you even survived just now. It feels a little weird to say this, but I think that the ambiguity of where the hitboxes are on the boss is a negative consequence of the game looking as good as it does. The devs didn't just compromise the visual fidelity of anything in this fight just to make the fight more readable. So when you first encounter her, you can feel a little overwhelmed by her size, questioning how you can even get past her magnificent thickness. It all comes to a head when she rears up to swipe down at you or lunges with her claws. It's a fight that can easily end up being visually confusing as you're panicking and bouncing around, trying desperately not to get hit. As confusing as it is in the beginning though, after enough deaths, you'll start to understand where's safe, what attacks are punishable, and how to move around the arena with relative freedom as you pound her into a fine mush. At least until you finally reach phase 2 and panic more as the arena expands and she gains new attacks. This phase is fine, more of the same with a little more chaos thrown in the form of her spiderlings and laser beams, and the ranged attacks that I mentioned earlier. This phase would be great, except that this cocoon on the right side of the arena can't do its job when the physics engine decides to implode. Once you finally manage to get her down to half health, there's a small chase sequence into the second half of the fight into a new arena where I immediately died. Luckily, there's a checkpoint here, making it so that from now on, each death will start you at the beginning of this phase of the fight, but man, if you didn't know that, it's a real good scare, since getting her to this point in the first place was a rough 7-minute survival challenge that I was not looking forward to doing again. From here on though, if you were able to get through the first half of the fight, then it's only a matter of time until you get through this second half. Again, there are 2 phases to this half of the fight, with the second one shrouding the arena in darkness and making you panic even more. But the fight is largely more of the same of what you dealt with in the first phase. I actually kind of got lucky here and ended up causing Mora to loop a couple of attacks in the same place, allowing me to wail on her through the entirety of this phase. After the pain of the first half, I was happy to have pulled it off and survived. Maybe it was all the practice at the beginning of the fight, or maybe it was the cheese that I found, but this half of the fight ended up being significantly easier than the first, taking me only 1 death and 3 minutes worth of attempts from the first time that I reached this room. This was a really frustrating boss fight, and I think it was simply because of the lack of damage upgrades that I went into this fight with. I can't say that it wasn't a lot of fun though, because even though this boss had a little bit of jank to it, it seemed entirely fair once I began to understand how it moved. It's the kind of fight that makes you learn a lot about how the game's combat flows, and forces you to experiment and try new things outside of what you've been relying on up until this point in the game, and it's so much fun. I can't speak to what the experience is like on normal mode or fighting this boss after Frog Dad, but while I did find it fun, I want to say that it's probably way too hard. Nothing outside of the other boss fights can even compare to the endurance challenge that this boss provided. Nothing could have really prepared you for this either. And if I felt like I was unable to accomplish the feat of defeating Mora at the time that I first encountered her, I don't know what I would have done. Would the game have allowed me to just quit and return to a previous checkpoint? I don't know. And I have to wonder how many people were turned off by this boss because they just weren't able to power through. And maybe the intention was to tackle this boss and this area after Frog Dad, but it's impossible to know that going in blind. Looking back on it though, this fight is very, very good. It's the first fight of the game that really pushes the combat system in this game to its limits. But maybe it would have been better suited as an endgame or even post-game challenge at this level of difficulty. I'm curious though, for those of you who played this game, did you go to Mora first, and did she pose as much of a challenge to you as she did to me? And if you went to her second with the benefit of damage upgrades, how was she then? So I went back recently for a second playthrough because I wanted to test a couple of things, and even though I had the benefit of knowing that damage upgrades exist, I took another fight against Spider-Mom Mora on hard mode without any of those damage upgrades, same as I did before. What's interesting though is that her AI seems to be extremely exploitable in the way that I mentioned earlier. It's still easy to get popped by her if you make a mistake or two, but you can very easily get her trapped in a very exploitable loop that lets you wail on her as much as you want until the phase is complete. You can execute this loop in every single phase of the fight, except for the escape sequence of course, and it kinda turns the fight, which is otherwise epic and chaotic, into a bit of a joke. Frog Dad Kwolok is the second of the 2 bosses that you can tackle in any order. I found him significantly easier than Mora, but like I mentioned earlier, I had the benefit of a couple of damage upgrades helping me out this time. In addition to the practice I got from Mora, and even though he felt easier, the fight did take me a total of about 16 minutes worth of attempts to defeat him, only 4 minutes less than Mora. 2 minutes of that was spent on a relatively short but difficult chase sequence, and the rest was spent on the fight. Once you get past the chase sequence, there are no more checkpoints, and aggression is the name of the game. Kwolok is so large and so often stationary that the Shuriken ability, which acts like a boomerang, can do a ridiculous amount of damage as it passes through. If you're not dodging, you want to either throw a ranged attack, I personally liked the spear and the Shuriken, or be approaching for a melee combo. Frog Dad was significantly less chaotic of a fight than Spider-Mom was, and I think it's because of his shape. With the exception of his throat pouch doing damage to you if you carelessly bump your head into it, his hitbox was fairly easy to read, and his attacks, once you learned what they did, were easy to understand and then avoid the next time you saw them. Where Mora was grounded for the entirety of her fight, Kwolok is suspended in the air. He likes to stay still most of the time, and while he'll occasionally move in for an attack, it's pretty rare, and he'll most often go right back to center stage for you to continue wailing on him when he's done. There are 2 major phases to this fight. The first is dry, and the second is halfway filled with water. That sounds pretty awful, but the swimming controls in this game are so fluid and fast that it actually makes the fight significantly easier once you enter that second phase. He gains a few new attacks during the water phase, and each of his old attacks get a bit more complex, but nothing that isn't easy to overcome once you realize what's happening. Part of what makes the first phase more difficult than the second phase is that it's hard to get on Kwolok's level to deal enough damage to him. You don't have the benefit of water to boost you up, so a lot of my damage was done using ranged attacks while I dodged everything, getting a cheeky swipe in here and there. Once the water's raised, it's easy enough to jump up to a position where you can pummel him, using the jump reset mechanic of connecting with an attack to stay floating in the air as you do damage. It's still easy to get knocked out of this rhythm though, as you're going to have to dodge back and forward just to avoid the swipe of his arms and the caress of his long, sticky tongue, so it's not like this phase of the fight is free. Overall though, it's not the hardest fight in the game, but it's incredibly fun, but it's partially ruined by the fact that, whoops, you killed Frog Dad, you monster! On my second playthrough, I came to fight Frog Dad first, and without any damage upgrades this time, he was significantly harder, and I also didn't have the benefit of the Shuriken ability. I did, however, have the benefit of the Fireball ability, and I don't know if those things evened out, but without damage upgrades, Frog Dad was surprisingly difficult. The Willow Stone is another anomaly in this game's set of bosses in that it comes out of seemingly nowhere, is short and simple to defeat, and feels somewhat out of place. There's not much to talk about here. It's an energy core that's protected by a couple of layers of rock that you have to destroy first to do any damage. It's a sort of bullet hell situation, but you reach this boss mere moments before the end of the game, so you're as capable as you can possibly be. Once you learn its attacks, all it takes is a little bit of patience and a lot of dodging to take this thing out. Pretty fun to flex your complete set of abilities against too. Shriek is the game's final boss fight and took me a solid 17 minutes to beat. Not because the fight is particularly difficult, but because Shriek has a whole lot of health and 3 full phases, each with a different set of attacks. For the most part, once you understand what hurts and how to avoid it, it's simply a matter of wailing on her and avoiding her attacks until the next phase begins. The first phase is more of a warm-up that won't take very long. Shriek tries to crush you and you try to stab her. After the first phase is a small chase sequence as you move towards the second phase, which is by far the longest. This phase takes up more of Shriek's health bar and, unfortunately, more of your time. Both of these first 2 phases are riddled with attacks that cause Shriek to either go into the background or fly off screen as part of the attack, rendering you completely unable to fight back until she comes back to the stage. And even when she does, the windows in which you have to attack her are often very short before she completely disappears again. This fight was ultimately pretty fun, but mechanics like this that force you to wait for an opportunity to do anything except dodge are very frustrating to me. The loop of this fight could have been a lot more exciting if each attack that sends her off screen didn't do that, but instead caused her to be more difficult to hit or require different abilities to make up for the distance. Add some risk and reward to the fight instead of just saying, "Too bad, it's not your turn." There's also an attack in the second phase where Shriek telegraphs a direction and swoops past for a massive amount of damage if she touches you. There might be some way to reliably avoid this attack, but she covers such a large surface area and it seems like the direction she flies in is able to deviate at least a few degrees from the telegraph, making it very difficult to reliably avoid. Out of all my attempts here, I never got quite comfortable with avoiding this attack, nor did I feel like I was close to really understanding it, so I'm not a fan. For the very last small chunk of her health, Shriek destroys the rest of the ground to begin Phase 3. At this point, bullets are perpetually raining from the sky, which effectively allows you to fly as long as you're able to safely bash your way from one to another. As this starts, Shriek does that swoop attack that I just described, and with as much noise as there is on the screen in this moment, it's incredibly difficult to even see the indicator that shows where she's coming from. I mostly tried to use the power of luck to survive here. Once you're safe, Shriek comes down to meet you eye to eye and is quickly defeated by returning a few of the bullets that she barfs in your general direction. I have a number of issues with this fight, but I still had a lot of fun with it. The presentation here is nothing short of astounding and feels suitably epic for a final confrontation with such an imposing antagonist. The camera is pulled so far back that Ori feels absolutely dwarfed by the sheer size of this monster, and Ori's singular light among the dark corruption creates a striking visual composition that you cannot help but appreciate. The fight could be better by changing up some of the just wait for her to come back mechanics, but the presentation is masterful, and even with my complaints, Shriek's a pretty great boss. Oh, did I say I'd cover each boss briefly? Whoops. I guess I had more to talk about than I thought. As I went over each boss, I hope you were able to see as Ori's skill set and my own gameplay managed to evolve over the course of the game. The sheer number of options that you have in combat by the time you reach the end of the game is pretty incredible and makes the combat feel almost as freeform and as expressive as the platforming itself is. It feels really good to just engage with enemies as you're bouncing around the map, bashing off one enemy towards another to slice them a few times until they're ready to attack, just to dodge away into the next enemy for some damage, just to jump back to the first as you're throwing a fireball towards yet another enemy. It turns into a dance. It seems like it's messy and chaotic, but the game gives you all the tools that you need and the means to control the chaos, and it feels amazing. It's clear that a lot of work went into this game's combat as if to apologize for how awful the combat was in the first game. And because of that, I can't help but feel disappointed that there isn't more. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this game seems to borrow so much from Hollow Knight, and how the combat feels is part of that. Granted, Ori's combat is significantly more complex than what Hollow Knight offers, but the inspiration can be seen regardless. Hollow Knight had over 40 bosses to explore the game's combat with, while Ori has a measly 6. Remember how I mentioned that the Horn Beetle and the Willow Stone feel a bit out of place compared to the other large, more important bosses of the game? Remember how Howl wasn't actually killed by you and just ran away instead, promising you a rematch, only to get killed off screen instead? These things make it feel like Ori may have been meant to have a lot more bosses at some point, like Hollow Knight does. But it doesn't, and the combat feels woefully underexplored as a result. Some of the most fun I had with this game's combat came in the final area that I explored, Bar's Reach. This is a desolate frozen zone full of some of the most difficult enemies in the game, the Kwolok warriors. These guys have a lot of health and do a lot of damage, so you have to be careful fighting them. There are a few moments in the game that forced me to learn about the game's combat system more. The first was Mora, the second was Frog Dad, and the third were these hardy fellas. And once you've reached this point in the game, these are the only thing that you've got left to test your mettle against. Sure, Shriek is a fun boss that tests your abilities, but fighting these Kwolok warriors again and again is the most difficult thing that you can do with this game's combat until you reach Shriek, and, well, it just isn't enough. I just want more. The game gives us so many tools, so many of them situational to the encounter that you're in, but such a low variety of significant encounters to force that experimentation. I will say though that if this game had even half as many bosses as Hollow Knight did, I think that the game's excellent pacing would suffer. Exploration is one of the defining features of a metroidvania, whether you're uncovering uncharted territory or going back to discover the hidden secrets of an older area. Exploration and the abilities that drive it are central to the experience. I've been thinking about it though, and I'm not sure I know how to accurately judge how well-paced something is. I mean, Hollow Knight is a game that notoriously takes dozens of hours to beat and complete, where the upgrades trickle in slowly and deliberately as you go back and forth around an enormous world. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, on the other hand, took about 13 hours to beat and about 14 to reach completion. Had I been playing on normal mode and not going out of my way for every little collectible, it might have been closer to 9 or 10 hours. I haven't bothered crunching the numbers precisely, but Ori might even have more things to find and collect than Hollow Knight does, and given the relative length of each game, that's saying a lot. There's the usual life upgrade and health upgrade fragments, but you can also find Kwolok ore to use to help rebuild the game's town. Oh yeah, there's a town this time. Random items to use to solve some of the NPC side quests. Oh yeah, there are side quests now. A map merchant in each area to show you what's coming up ahead. Does that sound a little familiar? Small caches of currency to spend on upgrades at various merchants. Oh yeah, there's merchants now. And even little challenge shrines that award money and shard slots, which, if you've been paying attention, I didn't bring up at all in the combat portion of this video, even though they very directly affect combat. But don't worry, I'm going to be going over shards in quite a bit of detail later, so we don't need to worry about that now. And of course, all of that is on top of the usual collection of abilities and shards that you'll be finding throughout your adventure. In spite of a similar number of collectibles between the two games, Ori is a much faster-paced game than Hollow Knight is. In fact, I think it might be a little bit too fast-paced for its own good. One thing I really appreciated about Hollow Knight was how much room it gave you to explore the abilities and upgrades you've earned. And it could be an hour before you find anything else, be it a mask shard, a charm, or even a full-on ability. In Ori, it feels like you're finding something new every 20 to 30 minutes, and I don't want to say that that's a bad thing because each game's pacing fits with the way the game plays. Hollow Knight is slow and deliberate, and a lot of its design is based around enhancing that pace and keeping it from getting too dry. Ori is fast and frenetic, and its pacing matches up quite nicely. The side effect though, and why I think that the game could be slowed down just a bit, is that you're not given a whole lot of time to get comfortable with any one thing before finding the next shiny reward. For example, when I discovered the bow, I got one little area full of bow gimmick puzzles, and half an hour later I moved on to Bash, something that's way more interesting and far more useful than the bow in just about every way. Sure, I used it for combat a little bit, but it was so weak that I quickly forgot about it and tucked it away since other abilities were more interesting and more powerful. The thing is billed as an important ability since it comes from a spirit tree, but it's pretty easily outclassed by a few abilities you can just buy directly from a merchant. Some abilities are explored very well. Bash is always great, and the dash and grapple abilities both come to mind as abilities that take the spotlight and continue being useful for long after you acquire them, and, I totally get it, not every ability can be a masterpiece. But I have to wonder just how much Ori would be able to get away with if it tried to be as slow and as deliberate as Hollow Knight is. Would players be able to stomach a bashless Ori for 5 or even 10 hours before the game opens up? What about 20 hours of escalating combat and platforming challenges? Is it really Ori's movement speed that makes it require a faster-paced game? It's hard to say for sure. I just know that I would have appreciated a little more time in between each significant event. That's not to say that Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a small game either. Each area is pretty large, but again, because of Ori's skill set, it's by necessity. Large gaps in between jumps and high verticality is all but required to give Ori the room to fly and make use of the abilities you're given. Which of course means that if more time were needed in between each significant event, then that would almost directly translate into way more work on the level designer's part. It's a tough trade. Ultimately though, I'm happy with where this game sits. It's very easy for a game to feel like it overstays its welcome, taking way too long to reach its natural conclusion, but Ori moves at such a fast pace that doesn't even come close to happening. While the game's pacing is great, its exploration aspects fall a little bit flat for me. The first game, Ori and the Blind Forest, is considered by some purists to not even be a metroidvania because of how dungeony it is. Meaning you go to an area, you solve it, leave, and never need to return. In fact, there are even a few actual dungeons in the game that, before the game was patched, couldn't be returned to for completion once you beat it, so you were screwed if you didn't collect everything the first time around. This game doesn't stray too terribly far from the world design that the original game established, but there are efforts made to make it at least a little bit more complex and interesting. The central areas of Will of the Wisps are connected pretty well, with one of the connections managing to surprise me as I found myself in the beginning area of the game after exploring a middle section of the game. But in spite of how many things you might miss on your first trek through an area, the game still feels remarkably dungeony. Bar's Reach, Moldwood Depths, the Luma Pools, the Wellspring, and the Windswept Wastes are all examples of areas that you just are completely done with once you finish them for the first time. Most of these areas only have one choke point as the only entrance and exit to the zone, making it feel way more detached from the larger world than is probably necessary. Though this complaint verges more on the personal biases side of things, since it doesn't really affect the gameplay in any significant way, since you can teleport to any save point you found from anywhere on the map. In fact, most of the areas feel like a whole dungeon on their own on your first time through the area, which I actually didn't realize until my second playthrough. Your first run through a zone is often dotted with little events. Maybe it's a door that you have to open, or a cutscene that you have to see, or water that you have to drain. But once that's done, it's done forever. Every time you come back to a zone or any area in the zone, travel through it is free and easy since the area had already been solved. It was a little strange for me to realize this because by the end of the game, I had pretty much completely forgotten what my first experience through each zone was like. The game is super dense with obstacles and small puzzles, but once they're done, the areas open up as you power up and the zones start to feel wide open and, as a result of that, kinda small. So while many of the areas feel like a miniature dungeon when you first enter them, as you solve them they lose that dungeon status and just become a normal zone. It's actually kinda neat. Will of the Wisps is a pretty guided experience as far as metroidvanias go, and while I personally prefer the organic exploration and stumble-uponness of a game like Hollow Knight or Environmental Station Alpha, I can definitely appreciate the more narratively focused approach that the Ori games give. You almost always know where to go and when to go there, with the notable exception being around the middle point of the game when you're told to go around the world to collect the remaining wisps of light left behind by the now corrupted Willow tree. At this point, some players might start to feel a little overwhelmed because now you have 4 targets and you've got to choose. Fortunately, you can tackle these 4 areas in any order you please, with the minor exception that you can't tackle the final small dungeon of the Windswept Wastes until you collect the wisps from the other 3 areas, which was a bit of a letdown for me in hindsight since I went there first. It's pretty cool though that with this being a Metroidvania and with such a huge focus on abilities, that you can tackle each area immediately. This works because each of the 4 areas expects you to have all the power-ups that you've earned up until this point in the game, plus the one power-up that the rest of that area is built around that you earn in that area. Bar's Reach has the Light Burst ability, which lets you throw a projectile that you can bash off of. Windswept Wastes has the Burrow ability that lets you swim through sand. Moldwood Depths gives you a glorified flashlight that honestly has almost no use outside of that area, and the Luma Pools gives you the Swim Dash, which grants you an underwater attack, more swim speed, and the ability to launch out of water. Each area may have side puzzles that require an ability from a different area, but the main path is completely open for you to travel all the way to the zone's finish, which ends in either a boss fight or an escape sequence. While it's not required to have any other zone's ability to be able to make it through these 4 areas, one of the abilities in particular can help trivialize some of the puzzles in the zones. Specifically, taking Light Burst to the Luma Pools makes it so that you don't have to escort Bubbles with your flap ability to get around in some areas, which in my opinion only improved the experience there. It's cool to have the option to go where you want here, but the way that it's implemented kind of undermines some of the fun that could be had with these powers. In fact, 3 of these powers, the Sand Swim, the Swim Dash, and the Flashlight, are all very specific in their use cases. Swim Dash makes swimming suck less, and would probably be better suited as a shard or an optional upgrade. Burrow is literally only used to make a certain kind of terrain traversable. Sand and snow might as well be solid ground or solid walls in this game, and as a result, the ability doesn't meaningfully change the way you interact with the world. The sand and snow don't just impede your movement, they're literal stopping points. There are a few locations in the world where there are thin platforms of sand that can be used as mid-air boosters, but that use case is just as narrow. And the flashlight is... well, it only is required in the one dungeon that's covered in darkness and the one optional cave that you have to unlock with Gorlek ore. Other than that, it's an energy-draining minor damage aura, and who's got time for that? The strength of a good ability in a Metroidvania comes down to the number of uses it has and where it can be used. Something like the Sand Swim is poor because it only is useful in the areas where the designer decided to put sand. That may sound like a ridiculous and obvious statement, but when you compare it to the other abilities in the game, it makes sense. Look at Bash, for example. This is an incredibly versatile ability that opens up the game in a really big way. The acquisition of it completely recontextualizes every single enemy and projectile in the game. The way you interact with the world changes as a result of this ability. And while it might seem like a similar limitation, because it's only really useful where the designers decided to put enemies, the enemies are so ubiquitous that it doesn't even feel like a limitation. For an example, in some different games, look at the grapple ability in Super Metroid versus the one in Environmental Station Alpha. Super Metroid's grapple is lame, because its functionality is limited by these blocks and grapple enemies that are specifically placed in the game's world. Anywhere that these grapple points don't exist, the ability is useless and uninteresting outside of being a cute little farming tool for collecting items. But Environmental Station Alpha's grapple can be used on just about any surface it touches. It's not just a tool for bypassing a handful of areas in the game, it's a tool that's added to your moment-to-moment set of options to pull out at a moment's notice. Most of Will-o'-the-Wisp's abilities in the first half of the game are pretty good, and even the bow, as lame as it is a valuable option to have as you're going through the game. But the latter half of the game suffers just a bit from these weak abilities with very narrow use cases. I'm not trying to say that these abilities shouldn't exist, merely that they should be either better integrated into the world as a whole or be downgraded to more minor abilities that you either have to buy from a merchant or acquire in some way that isn't directly linked to a spirit tree. Because they do come from a spirit tree, they're given some level of importance to the game's world that doesn't really feel like it's matched by how it's represented in the way they play. Anyway, once all that's done, you get to go to the game's final dungeon, and on your way through it, you're rewarded with the ultimate movement tool, Launch. This ability is basically the same as Bash, but it can be done without a projectile. You get one launch until you attack an enemy or use Bash to reset it. This ability is wild, and when used in conjunction with the other abilities you've earned, you feel like you can do anything. It's super fun to use and incredibly well integrated with the final boss fight. Again, I just wish there were more challenges to really push these abilities to their absolute limits. Guacamelee, for example, has the Tule Treetops challenge that tests your skill with all of the game's various abilities in a very difficult climb. Hollow Knight has the White Palace and the Path of Pain to push your endurance to its limits with the game's precision platforming. Ori does have these little time trial obstacle courses, but those don't have the same feeling as a deliberately crafted devious challenge to give people heartburn. You know, fun heartburn. Hollow Knight is one of the best modern examples of a good metroidvania. Nothing can ever be truly perfect, but it does so many things right that it's only natural for games in the future to ape some of the elements that define Hollow Knight to make them their own. Ori and the Will of the Wisps feels so heavily inspired by Hollow Knight that, if you're a fan of both games, you'll notice within the first hour. NPCs that bounce between the world and main town, tight and crunchy combat using a sword, the charm or shard system, various merchants, and a shameless clone of Cornifer the Cartographer. And as soon as possible, I want to say that this isn't a bad thing. I just found myself distracted by the similarities in the first hour of play, so I kinda wanted to bring it up. And I'll admit, calling the sword a copied element might be stretching the truth a bit, because hey, games have swords in combat, so what? Ori's sword even has different attacks based on the direction you're holding as you swing, like an uppercut or a long-range stab, which is quite a bit more complex than what the knight has. But immediately after you get the sword and probably lose some of your first loot drops to a spike pit, you might lament the necessity to chase down every bit of loot that enemies drop as you fight throughout the game. I know I did, because I absolutely hate chasing down loot. But that's when you come across your first shard, Magnet. The shards feel like they're ripped straight out of Hollow Knight, as they're a system of limited slots that you can put various situational upgrades in. Some let your bow have more shots, some give you a damage boost, and some might even make the game harder. And while I have little doubt that this system exists because Hollow Knight did it first and was such a fun system, Ori manages to make it its own by requiring only one slot per shard, no matter how powerful it is. Most of the shards can also be upgraded multiple times to make them more powerful, and most of them have a much larger and more immediately noticeable impact on how you play the game. For example, there are a few bow-themed shards that make your weak little toothpick launcher into a rapid-fire shotgun that should not be messed with. There's a shard that increases the damage you take, but also significantly increases the damage you deal, making the game slightly harder. And there's my favorite, which probably heavily affected my enjoyment of the game's combat as a whole, the Bounty Shard. This shard makes the random fodder enemies in the game significantly harder, gaining 70% more health and dealing 70% more damage, while making them drop double the amount of this game's currency, Spirit Light. Buying all of the abilities, ability upgrades, shards, and shard upgrades was so prohibitively expensive that it felt necessary to stack all of the shards that increased the amount of light earned, even if it made the enemies more difficult to kill. Stacking Bounty with the shard that made me deal and take more damage meant that every slip-up was potentially lethal, but I think that made the combat a lot more fun for me. It allowed me to experiment with combos and truly learn what enemies are capable of, while learning how to dispatch enemies as quickly but as safely as possible. Unfortunately though, if the game wasn't so generous with its checkpoint system, I think that these stacking damage multipliers would have made the game really unfun. Imagine if you had to retread 10 minutes of content again and again and again, because each enemy was hitting you for more than half of your health. That wouldn't be a good time, but luckily the game is very generous, basically giving you a new save point just about every time you touch the ground. I think that in some ways this can be a design crutch, but I don't think that it's worth diving into that in this video. Just know that the game is very generous with its checkpoints, which all but invites some brutal difficulty. And hard mode just makes all of that much harder. Especially the money aspect, because surprisingly, hard mode seems to increase the cost of everything by 50% of what it is in normal mode. That's a bit of a weird choice to me because by the end of the game, even with the bounty and light harvest activated for a majority of the game's runtime, I wasn't really anywhere close to being able to buy out everything in the game. Sure, it was great having to make the hard decisions with my really limited funds, but that meant that if I wanted to 100% the game, I had to grind. I got kinda lucky when I went for my 100% shop completion because it turns out that there was a bug a while ago that made every subsequent kill of the same enemy drop more and more shards for each kill. Doing this, I managed to get to a point fighting this fella over and over again where he was dropping over 1500 light per kill, which made farming an absolute non-issue. Using this glitch, it took less than 10 minutes to go from flat broke to about 30,000 light, meaning I could buy out the shops, purchase some property, and start my own business selling pine cones and Gorlake ore. Even at this point in the game though, it cost me about 17,000 light to buy the rest of what I was missing. For having already beaten the game and collected everything on the map, this is a lot of money. Unfortunately, it seems this glitch has been patched out, which means that if you want to collect and buy everything, you're gonna have to do it the old-fashioned way and find grinding spots, especially if you're on hard mode. I think that this is bad for the game as it is, but once again, it comes back to me wishing there were just more to do and unlock in the post-game. If we had extra optional challenges and fights and areas that rewarded enough currency to cross this wealth gap, the grind would be more palatable, but geez, 17,000 light at endgame after completing literally everything else, after doing everything I could to maximize the amount of light that I earned per kill through a majority of the game? That's very, very not good. Anyway, this shard system was a ton of fun to play around with, and I wouldn't be upset if I saw it appear in some similar form in more games. My only complaint is that while easy to experiment with, it's really easy to find a set that you like and stick with it for the whole game, because some of them just seem outright superior to others in a really noticeable way. But hey, they can't all be incredible, right? So, Ku is in a death spiral, and Frog Dad says it's up to you to collect the rest of the Wisps and restore light to Naiwen. The main thing I want to talk about here is the game's strange tendency to make you feel sympathetic towards the significant bosses that you fight. Remember Mora, the horrifyingly devilish spider mom that probably triggers some legitimate arachnophobia in some people? Oh, it turns out that you didn't kill her. She was just a friendly spider mom who got corrupted by the darkness, and she's okay now, thanks for saving her. You might even realize at this point that all the spiderling monsters that you've killed up until now didn't actually die. They were just defeated and retreated underground. How convenient. This might sound silly, but I found myself pretty annoyed that Mora was so difficult to defeat and so large and disgusting, only for her to still be alive and now making me feel sorry for her through her story. It just kinda came out of nowhere, and it's made worse by what happens next, at least in the order that I went in. So it turns out that Frog Dad got corrupted too, but not just corrupted like Mora was, no. Frog Dad gets turned into a puppet by the corruption creature that we expelled from the water mill to clean the world's water. So not only are your actions towards fixing this corrupted land directly responsible for Frog Dad's corruption, Frog Dad actually ends up dying after you defeat him. Sure, the corruption beast dies too, but You're really gonna do this to me? You're gonna take the one significant character that you've built up as Naiwen's protector and father figure and been around forever and make me responsible for his death? And let Mora live? No, why? It's so upsetting that it almost feels manipulative. Even Shriek gets a sympathetic backstory. The gist is that Shriek was born deformed and ugly from the last surviving egg from a now petrified family of owls, and was outcast by the rest of her species. When all she wanted was friends and family, she was shooed away, left to grow up alone and bitter. She even rejects the kindness shown to her by Ori towards the end. And when she's defeated by you, she goes crawling back home to die in the petrified husks of her dead parents. What the f***, Moon Studios? Can't you just let me interact with the character in this game without making me feel like a complete asshole for doing my job? And then, just as everything was looking up, Ori sacrifices itself to become the new Willow of Nightwind, leaving poor Ku unable to see her best friend ever again and possibly being racked with trauma and guilt for being the reason Ori is now gone. Good luck explaining that one to your parents, who risked their lives to travel across the water in a makeshift raft that Gumo built. He thinks he's a brilliant engineer, but you saw how easily Ku's makeshift wing failed. They just arrived, and now they see their child is a tree? Joking aside, I actually really like how this ends. Ori's new power revives Ku and heals her gimped wing, and becomes the new light of Nightwind, allowing the land to flourish once again. It closes the loop started by the first game where Ori spawned from the desperation of a distressed Willow that just wanted to see its land saved. We're given a nice, wholesome look at the family's future in Nightwind, and the game ends. It's all presented so masterfully that it's hard not to get swept up in it. And if I'm being honest, I'm not much for story analysis, so I'll just leave it at that. Ori and the Will of the Wisps felt like the perfect follow-up to an already brilliant game. It takes what made Ori and the Blind Forest so great and polishes the crap out of it while greatly improving on many of the aspects that didn't work so well. It's hard for me to name a platformer that feels half as good and as free as this game does. But I just wish there were more. More challenges to push the insane mobility to its limits, more bosses and arenas to encourage and demand some experimentation and mastery of the game's combat. The game gives us such tight systems that are so fun to control, gives us a sip of nectar, and then says, sorry, that's it, no more. I know that what I'm asking for here is probably a monumental task for these developers, because look at the detail in this game. I can't imagine how much work was poured into each and every room, and not just visually. Think about that movement that I keep talking about, and how difficult it must be to keep the player going in the direction that they're designed to go with these abilities. But I suppose that's part of the risk of making something this gorgeous with movement systems this wild and fun. And I suppose it's the mark of a good and fun game when I just want more of it. And in spite of the complaints that I have, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is incredible and a must-play for, I think, just about anyone. Even my friend, who normally can't stand 2D platformers, managed to play and enjoy this game through to the end, so I mean anyone. I did end up rambling quite a lot in this video, and I still feel like there's so much more that can be talked about, but I have to end it somewhere. There's a lot packed into this game, but I'm so happy that it didn't suck. It's a sequel after all. But hey, if you're still here, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you made it, let me know by sneaking the word funitude somewhere in your comment, and I'll know you made it to the end. By the way, for those of you who don't already know, I do have a gameplay channel where I played through the entirety of Ori and the Will of the Wisps to 100%. I also like to play various roguelites and other metroidvanias. I'm going to be leaving a link to that playthrough in the description and at this video's end card, so if gameplay is the kind of content that you enjoy, then head over to that second channel and give it a watch. I'd greatly appreciate it. And I'd like to give a special shout out to Eric Lawrence for being a channel member of the highest tier. To everyone else, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.